Troy, we are now starting. Please
Okay,
go ahead. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Troy Stangerone, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute. We are delighted to be co-sponsoring today's discussion on economic security and the Inflation Reduction Act with our partners at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. We'll be dividing today's discussion into two parts. First, we'll look at some of the details of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the concerns raised by Korea and other U.S. allies. And then I will turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Kwok Sung-gil at KIEP, for a discussion of U.S.-Korea cooperation on economic security. However, first I'd like to turn to Dr. Kim Hung-chong, President of KIEP, and Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, President of KI, for opening remarks. Dr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Troy. Good morning to our audience in South Korea, and good evening to the U.S. audiences. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this important seminar today. I'd like to extend my gratitude to President of KEI, Kathleen Stevens, Senior Advisor Tami from the Albright Stonebridge Group, and Dr. Wonho, Dr. Kwon from KIEP, and Senior Director Troy Stangerone from KEI today. I'd also like to thank the staff members of KIEP and the KEI for their instrumental coordination efforts leading up to this web seminar. I'm confident that we can have a productive discussion by exchanging insightful ideas and thoughts on today's topic. First and foremost, we have all gathered here to discuss the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 on Korea and ROK-US trade and investment relations. As we all know, the IRA was implemented on August 16th of last year. In America, the IRA was praised as President Biden's biggest legislative achievement, delivering on his pledge to lower costs for families, create paying good jobs, and stimulate growth in the economy. From South Korean's viewpoint, however, we have diverse concerns about the impact of the IRA on our EV industries as well as EV battery sectors. Private firms in South Korea have invested a huge amount of money in the US, especially in constructing EV battery manufacturing facilities in some states such as Ohio and Georgia. On the other hand, they do not operate EV manufacturing factories both in the US and in North American regions, which is a necessary condition for EV tax credit according to the IRA. Thus, it is important to discuss how some provisions in the IRA have influenced our investment in the US and what strategies should be considered to minimize the potential negative impacts on related industries. Through today's discussion, I believe that we can find practical and meaningful ways to strengthen ROK-US trade and investment relations after the implementation of the IRA. Next, we'll extend our discussions to a wider range of issues concerning economic security. The CHIPS and Science Acts, or the IRA, are basically a kind of policy measures by the Biden administration to ensure economic security. Because of the complex structure of global supply chains for semiconductor, EV, batteries, and so on, economic security cannot be achieved through some actions by a single country. All the efforts of countries involved in critical industries should be coordinated and combined to achieve this goal. The idea of redeploying the US-centered global supply chain has been raised as the hegemony competition between the US and China intensifies. This makes it quite difficult to coordinate the cooperation efforts of many US allies and partner countries who also must consider their relations with China. Thus, our focus should be on the preparation of strategies and policies to restore the stability of a global supply chain and achieve economic security by diversifying those supply chains significantly concentrated on China instead of excluding China from global supply chain. Once again, I extend my warmest appreciation to participants for joining this webinar. I also look forward to opening discussions and our discussions on these important topics will help us to prepare strategies in response to change in global economic circumstances, as well as the future of ROK-US alliance. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you, President Kim. Ambassador Stevens?
Troy, thank you. And good morning to everyone in Korea. Good evening to everyone elsewhere in North America. President Kim, it's great to see you and other staff at KIEP, and Happy New Year to you. We've celebrated 2 New Years now. And I think you've laid out very well, Dr. Kim, what we hope to accomplish tonight. And maybe I can just add a couple things to that. But I do have to add my thanks as well to those who are going to be taking on this challenging task tonight, the discussion moderated by Troy, Tami Overby, and Dr. Wonho. I'm very much looking forward to it. I was thinking, Dr. Kim, President Kim, as you were talking, and here we are at the beginning of 2023 already. 2022 was such a pivotal year. And we could talk about big geopolitical events like, of course, the war in Ukraine at the beginning. But in terms of what, and that obviously impacts even what we're talking about tonight. But I'm thinking about the beginning of 2022. KIEP and KEI and others we were marking the 10th anniversary of the implementation of the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, which really did transform not only the economic relationship between our two countries, but I would say our strategic relationship as well. And it was very much something to be celebrated. And that was towards the beginning of the year. And in August, we had the passage not only of, as mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act, an enormous piece of U.S. legislation, but also of something called the CHIPS Act. And we also had, of course, the new Biden administration introduced something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, still to be filled out in many ways. So I think clearly last year a lot happened, but it hasn't been really fleshed out as to where this is taking us. And that's why I think what we're doing tonight is so important. It's very, very challenging. I find even the vocabulary we use is changing. We're not talking so much about trade, even using the word trade so much anymore. We're talking about words that I don't think 2 years ago we were using. Friendshoring, decoupling, even economic security, supply chain resilience. These are all words we're batting around like we've been talking about them forever. We haven't been. And I think we have a lot of work to do to come to our own understanding of how we go forward together. So I think it's very appropriate that tonight, as President Kim has already mentioned, that first we're going to look at the Inflation Reduction Act, and in particular, some of its provisions that have created a great deal of concern, not only in South Korea, but in other countries, and indeed in the United States, because of some of the steps it takes in terms of electric vehicles in particular. Of course, I guess it's about a 500-page piece of legislation. It has a lot in it that's and is viewed in many ways. We'll get to it as domestic legislation here, as well as foreign policy legislation, but it deals with things that are also very much important to Korea, like batteries, lithium batteries, solar panels, and much, much else that I think will be on the agenda going forward. But I think it's very important we look at where the concerns are tonight, and then, as we've mentioned, look more broadly as how do we work together in this very challenging time. And I just think there are two things that I've kind of thought about as I've struggled with some of these issues over the last year plus. And the first is, it seems to me that more than ever, it's always that domestic policy and foreign policy are intertwined. And whether we're sitting in the United States or we're sitting in Korea, we need to kind of at least try to understand what's going on the other side in terms of domestic policy and a variety of agendas, whether they're related to job creation, climate change, a whole range of issues at home. That's always been true in economic policies, but even more true now. So that intertwining of the two, I think, is very important. And secondly, as indeed this phrase economic security, which is used more than ever now, suggests that the traditionally rather separate dimensions of your economic experts and your security experts, we're having to talk to each other and talk about each other's issues. So it's incredibly, I think, intellectually challenging, bureaucratically challenging, diplomatically challenging. We've all got to stretch ourselves and expand our understanding to try to get to some solutions that are going to be sustainable going forward. So I really do appreciate our partnership with KIEP, with your experts there, to start doing that. Well, continue doing that, but start doing that in the new year tonight. So thank you very much for joining us tonight and this morning.
Well, Ambassador Stevens, President Kim, thank you both. I think this is a really good way to take and set the framework for today's discussion. And we're really excited about the two speakers we have. For that discussion, we have Tami Overby and Dr. Wonho with us today. Tami is a senior advisor in the East Asia and Pacific practice of the Albright Stonebridge Group. Previously, she served as the senior vice president for Asia and president of the U.S. Korea Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea. Dr. YEON is a research fellow and the head of the economic security team, quite appropriate for today's discussion, I think. And he received his PhD in economics from Stony Brook. And Dr. YEON, I think I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. President Kim and Ambassador Stevens have both brought up that, in addition to Korea, the EU, Japan, they've also expressed concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act. And they've also sort of hinted at some of the issues that are there. But could you maybe get into some of the specific areas of concern that Korea has with the Inflation Reduction Act for us?
Yeah. Thank you for having me today. Actually, regarding the question, when Department of Treasury asked for public comments on IRA, most comments were focused on clean vehicle tax credit. And as far as I know, 7 countries, including Korea, EU, Japan, also a variety of companies and associations, they made comments. And all these players actually voiced concern over the IRA's discriminatory policies, and which is particularly regarding the final assembly requirement. EU and Japan in particular expressed concerns comparable to those made by Korea regarding the tax credit for clean vehicle, including the final assembly requirements. Japan especially advocated relaxing final assembly and battery-related restrictions, so that EV and batteries produced in allied nations are not considered less favorably than those produced in North American countries in terms of tax credits. Also, EU raised worry about discriminatory policies across the IRA and considers that some of them may violate WTO regulations. Given that battery-related restrictions affect all market participants equally, I think the Korea's main worry is North American final assembly regulations. Yeah.
So, Dr. Yan, in that case, and I know there's been some suggestions out there, what types of changes would Korea be interested in seeing, or adjustments, if you will, to the Inflation Reduction Act?
So basically, the main problem is the discriminatory policy included in this IRA, and which actually came from the North American Final Assembly regulation. So probably Korean government really wants to expand the scope of, the defining this North American Final Assembly regulation. And partly, I think we succeeded in terms of expanding the scope because December 30th, Department of Treasury, they gave a guidance, the first guidance on tax credits for a commercial EV, and now we actually, Korean companies can enjoy some of the subsidies from the US government. But still, I think we have concerns because the last guidance, the December 30th guidance, that only included the guidance on tax credit for commercial EVs, and we are still waiting for the guidelines for the whole clean vehicle tax credits. Probably that will be, I think, released in March. So, still Korean government tries their best to actually reflect Korea's interest in the final guidelines.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Tami, I'd like to turn to you. Dr. Young mentioned that the EV batteries take and impact everyone roughly the same. But there is a difference in the sense that, Korea is playing a much larger role in the United States in the development of EV battery facilities. For example, Ford and its Blue Oval facility is partnering with SK On. So there is this deeper role in the United States for Korea. So how can private firms, in many cases where they share a common interest, be they Korean or US firms in this case, similar to the Blue Oval project, work together in this new legal environment?
Thanks, Troy. I think that's an excellent point in the fact that U.S. companies are very much also affected by these negative unintended consequences. We should note that this is a huge energy bill. The last energy bill took 10 years to negotiate. This one was done in 18 months. The last 6 or 8 weeks, it was done behind closed doors. So I think there was... and in a large bill like this, there are always unintended consequences. But I think it's important to note that companies like Hyundai Motors, and SK On, LGES, companies, the Korean companies are doing exactly what the U.S. government wants them to do by investing significant amounts of money in advanced manufacturing in the United States. In my 35 plus years covering U.S. Korea economic relations, I don't ever remember a U.S. president meeting individually with 3 chaebol chairmen in a roughly a 2-month period. He met with Samsung's chairman, Hyundai Motors, Chung Wi-sun, and he met with SK. With Chairman Che, and to see him put his arm around Hyundai Chairman Chung and say, "Thank you for this significant investment. I'm going to take care of you." That would lead many in Korea to feel good and comfortable. But then when the details come out about the IRA and we see that there are indeed some really serious issues. But as you pointed out, I do think there is common ground. The U.S. needs access to this cutting edge battery technology that SK and LG are, global leaders on. And I think there is a great opportunity to work together. But I would note that when I was in Korea in December, I met with one of the Korean battery, a CEO from one of the Korean battery companies, and he pointed out the challenge with the domestic content of the batteries, that it starts at 40% and that content's going to escalate, and that content must come from an FTA partner. Well, this CEO said, our company invested in mineral and mines in Indonesia for nickel and in Argentina for lithium, neither of which are FTA partners. He said, but now that we can't use those inputs for the purposes of our investment, our board is looking at divesting, selling those assets. And he said, who do you think will buy them? Which country has a lot of money and is trying to marshal critical minerals? It would probably go to the Chinese. And that clearly is not the consequence that Congress wanted when this bill was written. So I think there's a lot of fixes that need to occur. And again, U.S. companies have significant skin in the game, and they're going to want this fixed as well.
I think what you raise about the Chinese side of this, is important to keep in mind. One, because that's one of the objectives of the IRA, is to try and move some of these mineral supply chains out of China. But two, that if there's significant restrictions on where these minerals can be mined and reprocessed, that then you do take and end up potentially ceding a lot of, because let's be honest, not all of the world's minerals are in North America.
Troy, you went on mute.
sorry, did it go off at some point?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, sorry. So I'll just try to real quick encapsulate what I was saying, which is that, you know, it's going to be challenging because not all of the world's minerals happen to be in North America, US FTA partners. Clearly, you know, there's this objective to try and build up the supply chains that are sustainable. So I guess my question, you know, is sort of two-part. One, you know, 2025, we moved to where you can no longer use minerals from China. That's when the switch takes place. But do you see companies then moving reprocessing to North America? Or, you know, are there any plans by the US government to invest in these types of, you know, programs in North America? Because otherwise, you know, it's going to happen somewhere else.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert in that, but I will share that this Korean CEO reminded me that the smelting of many of these minerals is not a clean industry. And I can't imagine that the U.S. would want this type of reprocessing done. You know, we tend to be not in our backyard. So, you know, if it's not going to be in China, where's it going to be? I could see a lot of U.S. environmental groups ensuring it's not going to be here.
Well, that makes it challenging. If it's not in China, if it's not here, you know, which of our partners are going to want it? So, Dr. YEON, I want to turn back to you. You mentioned Treasury's initial guidance, and we talked about the EV credit and how Treasury's come out and said that basically for the commercial side, so things like rental cars and others, there won't be the same restrictions. You also mentioned, though, that Korea still wants to see the guidance on the private side, so vehicles purchased by individuals. How much does this change that Treasury has so far lessen Korea's concerns, or is this really just kind of a small change, but that really we need it on the individual consumer side at the end of the day? And the reason I ask this is because the reason Treasury is able to make this change is that there wasn't actually guidelines within the Inflation Reduction Act on the commercial vehicles to where the individual purchases, the consumer purchases are more specific. So I'd kind of like to get your thoughts on sort of how significant this change is from the perspective in Korea.
Yeah, so key demands from Korea are easing requirements for final assembly of EVs. Second, like relaxing battery requirements. Third, expanding the scope of tax credits to the clean commercial vehicles. And the last one is expanding the scope of tax credit for the use of clean manufacturing. And December 30th initial guideline actually included the guidance on tax credits for commercial EV. And the announcement actually is evaluated as part of the U.S. Government's efforts to actually mitigate discriminatory situations related to EV tax credits. With the announcement of this guidance, as commercial vehicle included leased vehicles, the Korean automobile industry can also receive a tax credit of $7,500 in the U.S. Through this commercial vehicle sales. Overall, the automobile industry and battery industries, they welcome this U.S. announcement and actively establishing strategies to maximize the benefits right now. For example, like Hyundai Motor Company, Hyundai, they plans to increase the portion of lease programs. Currently, they are at the level of 3 to 5% level, but they are trying to increase their lease proportion to 30% level. Also, battery industry, they evaluated the industries. This guidance actually captured a lot of, opinions from the industry. Tami a little bit mentioned about these key materials. I think the initial guidance actually included some parts regarding to the critical minerals also. For example, the North American manufacturing rate will be calculated based on the total component of the core minerals, not just the particular individual components or mineral. And also minerals extracted from countries that have not signed an FTA with the United States will be considered as products of an FTA country if they are processed in the FTA country with more than like 50% of value added. So these all actually are welcomed from the Korean industry, but we still expect more from the U.S. because the key the key components of this IRA, the guidance will be released in March. So that's the current situation in Korea, and we just wait and see the March guidance at this moment.
So, Tami, Ambassador Stevens mentioned at the beginning, the domestic aspect of things. And I want to stick with this question on, the guidance the Treasury's put out, because while, Korea and our partners overseas, we're glad to see at least these, initial potential, changes or, adjustments. The primary author of this legislation, Senator Joe Manchin, was not pleased. And he actually suggested that he might introduce legislation to close what he considers a loophole in the regulations. So do you have any concerns that Congress may take steps to roll back the administration's efforts to meet the concerns of our partners abroad?
It is a real concern, and it's something I think we have to take seriously. But it is also encouraging that at the most senior levels of the U.S. government, President Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary Raimondo, Secretary Yellen, USTR Tai, everybody is talking about the need to try to find a constructive solution. I think we need to pull the aperture back a little bit and realize that this, in my perspective, this is a much bigger issue than just EVs and batteries. This is really, in every boardroom in Seoul, business executives are watching. Is the U.S. going to be a trustworthy and predictable and a business certain partner, and again, for me, the irony, my early career in Seoul in the late 80s and early 90s, I was constantly encouraging the Korean government to please create a predictable and certain environment so that U.S. investors can invest more. Well, the irony to hear my Korean friends who are making tens of billions of dollars of high quality investments in America, asking for the same. So I think while certainly politics in the U.S. in every market can get really ugly, and Joe Manchin has said what he has said. But I think America needs to really look at this more broadly because, do we want more high quality Korean investment? If so, we need to create an environment where it's welcome, where it's predictable, where they can, as Hyundai has done, make a $5.8 billion commitment for an EV plant, creating thousands of high paying quality jobs. And know that our policy is not going to be politically used in a negative way. I'll get off my soapbox.
Oh, sorry. No. I think, this is important because, I kind of obliquely, when I was talking about the Blue Oval project, was talking about this. But if you look at the investment, not necessarily, in some cases, maybe even on a dollar scale, but in terms of high capacity batteries, so the ones that are going to go into electric vehicles, there's been a few announcements since, so this isn't the most up-to-date number, but basically, roughly 12 out of the 14 high capacity battery factories that are going to be built in the United States between now and 2025 are going to take and have either sole Korean ownership or be joint ventures like the Blue Oval project with U.S. companies. So, it's not just a question, even in some cases in terms of dollar amount, just the sheer capacity if we're going to make this transition is really being pushed by the, or not pushed, but is being enabled by the Korean private sector. And I think that's something that people don't realize. And even if we step for a moment outside of the EV battery sector, you know, Hanwha Q-Cell the other day announced a major investment in Georgia. And by 2024, that will give them enough capacity to produce essentially the equivalent number of solar panels that were produced this past year in the United States. So on solar, you know, a Korean firm is going to drastically to expand U.S. production capacity. The battery side, you know, it's largely Korean firms that are doing this. So I think, you know, this investment point you make, Tami, is really, really key.
This is the message that really I wish every member of Congress could hear, is that Korea Inc. has gone all in investing in their latest, most cutting edge technology in the U.S. And again, job creation, supply chain security. And we need to show them that that's welcome and that we're going to take care of those investments. These issues need to be resolved. They need to be resolved equitably and as quickly as possible so that we can, continue to attract more high quality Korean investment.
Couldn't agree more. So, Dr. Yoon, I want to turn to you. And, the U.S. created a working group with the EU to try and look at potential adjustments that might be feasible under U.S. law. Korea, I think to its credit, initially called for the EU and Japan to work together to try and find a resolution to their issues over the Inflation Reduction Act. Are there concerns in Korea about a grouping, with the U.S. government that basically doesn't include Seoul's involvement, but could perhaps shape the way the law is, changed, but also given what we just talked about in terms of Korean investment, how it's going to impact those Korean firms that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so we definitely want to involve in these talks with EU and Japan. But the fundamental problem is that the IRA contains discriminatory provisions, and the key point is that Korea should not be treated less favorably than other countries such as the EU, Japan, as well as the US in the process of implementing the IRA. As far as I know, Korean government has been also communicating with the EU, Japan, such as like last November, Korea, EU trade ministers, they met in the Europe and talked about IRA issue. So basically we all should work together to find a balanced solution so that this issue does not undermine our relationship. Yeah.
Troy, can I just add on? Dr. Yoon made a really important point about fairness. Americans should realize that Section 232, the steel tariffs, the U.S. has cut a deal with Japan, they cut a deal with the Europeans, but they have not cut a deal with Korea. In fact, former trade minister, you hosted him, Troy, last month, and he was pointing out that it really is an issue of fairness. Korea is a very strong ally, a strong, a democracy, a free market economy, and an increasingly strong investor in the U.S., and they deserve to be treated fairly, and we should get rid of those 232 steel tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, the 232, I think, is somewhat perplexing that it's still on the table, that there hasn't been anything done. We did a deal with the UK as well because of Brexit. So, exactly. There's an additional deal out there. But I think, and I agree with Dr. Yoon on, this fairness issue as well. And I mean, this is why I wanted to ask about this working group with the EU, because, it seems like if the US is really going to try and, justice, as Dr. Yoon said, you need to take and try to make sure that it's fair to all the parties. It shouldn't be, fair to only Korea or only the EU or only Japan. And so by having a working group that, in essence, gives one party an inside lane, if you will. And, I think it's great that the EU is talking with Korea, and I hope that they're taking everything on board and that, they're looking at it that way. But, at the end of the day, there really should be a grouping that includes all of the relevant parties. And I think, to be honest, it might actually behoove, the United States to take and sort of make something permanent with the US, the UK, the EU, Japan, and Korea that looks at these types of climate issues going forward. So that way, when we have the next piece of legislation come out in any of the countries, EU is not a country, but you know what I mean, that, we don't have these issues going forward. And so that way we can do this in a smoother way. And so I think, this fairness issue is an important point in how we try to handle this issue going forward. But so, Tami, I do want to ask you on the theme of potential changes still. Do you see any scope for the administration to provide further relief to Korea or the other U.S. partners who've been negatively impacted by the law? Or are we really going to have Congress amend the law if we want more substantive changes?
Well, I do think at some point there will be a congressional fix. Because I think as time goes on, we're going to find more and more unintended consequences out of that. But one of the challenges is that in certain areas, the language is so precise, it doesn't leave room to resolve things. But you and I were talking earlier about a potential discussion that's being had about definitions and what is a free trade agreement? Maybe it could be IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which Korea and Japan are both parties to. Also, or as you mentioned, the Minerals Supply Partnership.
Yeah.
There could be creative way, and there need to be. It's going to have to be creative. But at the end of the day, I think the goal is to help facilitate our transition to lower carbon emissions, and our Korean friends want to help us, and they're creating high paying jobs. So let's make that easy.
Yeah, and I would like to add, I think the broader hope too is that in the long run this will be profitable for everyone as well. So it's not just about reducing emissions, but finding a way to do this. And in that perspective, I was reading, there was an FT story the other day talking about how China is pushing EVs very aggressively, that they are leaders in the technology and they want to sell them abroad. And so this is one of those situations to where it's not just about the environment. There is really a competitiveness issue, I think, here as well. And, so I think we need to keep that in mind too. So Dr. Yoon, I would like to turn it back to you. So I think we all understand, why Korea is concerned about the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's very understandable why. But are there potential benefits from the law for Korea, outside of the things we've talked about so far today?
Yeah, so the estimated amount of U.S. government support for IRA related to clean energy is about, I think, 500 trillion won. I think that's equally like 370 billion US dollars for 10 years. So I think this is a huge opportunity for Korean industry to expand market entry into the U.S. by making most of these IRA subsidies, especially in the fields of batteries, solar power, like wind power, and even like nuclear power. I think earlier Tami mentioned about ROK-US, and Troy also mentioned about ROK-US. ROK-US, I think they have a plan to have a new factory in Georgia, also CS Wind, which will also which has planned to build a factory in Colorado. Also, we expect some benefits from the nuclear cooperation with the United States. I think this IRA also includes the huge subsidies to nuclear power generating and I think there are much opportunities for Korean companies to actually export some of the key parts to the U.S. Lastly, I think IRA also captures some support for the hydrogen industry. So that's another area that Korea can be benefited from the IRA. Yeah, that's my comment. Yeah.
And I'd also point out that if we look back at the summit meeting between President Biden and President Yoon, if you touch at all these areas, small modular reactors, hydrogen, EVs, they're all areas to where the U.S. and Korea, on an official level, have said, we want to try and build deeper cooperation in these areas. This, I think, could help do some of that. So, Tami, in light of the concerns over the Inflation Reduction Act, what impact do you see this having on the broader trade and investment environment between the U.S. and Korea? There's been some strong words, I think, especially early on, but do you think this is something that is going to have a negative effect, or do you see this as more as like a bump in the road that we can kind of work through?
Well, I very much hope it's a bump in the road that we can work through because, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think in boardrooms across the peninsula, they're watching this very closely to see, does the U.S. really welcome Korean investment? And is the U.S. going to, are we becoming more protectionist? Can we be a trusted partner? So I very much, I don't think we have a choice. I think we need these investments. These are good, high quality, sustainable investments. Samsung's offered a 20-year, $200 billion picture for the future of 11 or 12 more fabs coming to the U.S. So, South Korea is a clear partner, a strong ally. So we don't have a choice. We have to resolve this. But we need to do it quickly. And again, we need to do it in a fair manner. The worst thing in the world would be if we fixed this problem for one of our other allies. The 232 with steel just really is an issue that the U.S. must address. I mean, from the very beginning, it didn't make any sense. A national security threat on steel. We don't go to war in cars. I mean, it never made. And why would we punch our friends and allies first? It just never made sense. But to today still have POSCO being competitively disadvantaged, it makes no sense. We need to recognize who our friends are, and we need to treat them better.
So, Tami, along those lines, if I could just maybe ask a follow-up question. We know about the steel issue, but are there other issues out there that you think would behoove the United States to try and work through, or do you think it's primarily steel and the IRA?
Well, I think those are the biggest issues that are on everybody's that's on everybody's plate. But the export controls with China, hit Korean companies hard, and they were given a short waiver for a year to try to figure it out. But that year is going to go very quickly, and I think we have to realize that China is. First of all, the whole idea of decoupling from China, broad decoupling, is foolish, and we shouldn't even consider it. But certainly, I think the Biden administration has made very clear that for high-tech, dual use, for that really thin, and they've been very specific about it. There is going to be a decoupling at that highest technology level. But we need to do that in a thoughtful manner. We need to make sure that we're working with our allies, that other countries also follow the same direction. Otherwise, as we've seen in the past, if the U.S. is the only one closing markets, other countries have gone in behind us and sold things. So, for this to work, we need to have much more cooperation with like-minded friends and allies. And I think that involves collaboration, bringing our closest friends into a deeper conversation earlier.
So, Tami, I have one last question, if you don't mind. We've talked a lot about the battery issues. Obviously, there's clear provisions in terms of the tax credit, but companies can still sell an EV in the United States, just the winning the tax credit if they use one that doesn't meet those provisions. So, obviously, the largest battery company in the world is CATL. Tesla's often use their batteries. Do you see the Biden administration perhaps at some point moving forward to either use higher tariffs or some type of mechanism such as 232 to try and keep Chinese batteries out, even while it's trying to disincentivize them through the tax code? Or do you think that's probably not a realistic answer, that they're going to stick to trying incentivizing rather than punishing?
Well, I think that's a great question. And if you put a gun to my head and said, guess, I would guess that we're coming into the election season. Both parties want to be seen as being, hard on China. And tariffs certainly got the Chinese attention. I could envision a scenario where they did slap more tariffs on. Since President Biden's been inaugurated, we haven't seen any tariffs come off. So,
yeah, and I'll be honest, I don't think those are going to come off anytime soon, the ones from the Trump administration.
Once you put them on, it's really hard to remove them. Yes. And again, you're coming into an election year, and there are certain segments of our electorate like the tariffs.
Yeah. Well, now I'd like to hand things off to Dr. Kwok Sung-gil, who is the director of the Economic and Security Strategy Department and a senior research fellow at KIEP. Clearly very well qualified to cover our next set of questions on our next part of our discussion on economic security. Dr. Kwok, I turn things over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Troy. And nice to see you, Ms. Dr. YEON and Ms. Tami. Okay, I think we already know the old panelists, so I go directly to our sessions. Recently, we have observed the massive changes taking place across the global landscape. The COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's war in Ukraine, and the rising tide of authoritarian populism have exposed many of the key assumptions and ideas that guided the economic policy for decades as deeply problematic. All the things that made conventional neoliberal globalization possible, that is cheap capital, cheap energy, cheap labor, all those things are breaking apart. So, Mr. YEON, under this circumstance, could you tell us a bit about how Korea views the issue of economic security?
Yes. Given the intertwined global, we can define the economic security as protecting the nation's survival from external economic threats and risks. And national survival can be defined as survival in the moment, in the present, and survival in the future. And survival in the present is related to mostly supply chain issues, such as achieving energy security and food security. And survival in the future is related to one's competitiveness, such as developing and protecting critical technologies and strategic industries. So we can say the key areas of economic security are supply chains, advanced technologies, and digital space. In particular, digital space is important because it actually serves as a corridor of goods, money, and knowledges, and even technologies. And the Korean government, in terms of supply chain issue, they actually implemented early warning system, and also the government is trying to propose an act, special act on supply chains to form the fund to support companies when supply chain disruption occurs. And regarding the advanced tax, actually, Korean government has three pillars, three kind of ways to cope with this situation. The first one is protecting particular technologies, which Korea already has like #1 technologies, and also which are all industrialized. And second way is to actually foster and protect some particular technologies related to supply chains. So this means to secure our supply chains, some particular technologies are very important, but that those technologies should not necessarily be high tech. So if we do not have those technologies, then the Korean government tries to actually promote to develop those technologies. And if we have those technologies already, then we would like to protect those technologies. And the third pillar is developing advanced technologies, which have not yet been industrialized, such as like AI, like quantum, aerospace, robotics, big data analysis, and so forth. So regarding the third pillar, the currently Ministry of Science and ICT, they just announced like 12 technologies last year in October. And they are trying to actually also propose a special act on this. So probably we will see that act this year. That's the current kind of concept on economic security of the Korean government. So supply chains, advanced tax, and digital space. But digital space still, I think Korean government treats this issue as a defense issue rather than the economic security issue.
Thank you. Now, let's turn to the United States. I think many in Biden administration believe that the traditional free trade agreements have benefits, whereas corporations and their executives at the expense of workers. The administration seems to be determined to rectify that inequity. So far, this has meant avoiding traditional trade negotiations that include the market access and instead promoting reshoring or at least friendshoring to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act that we covered last session is a good example of this, providing substantial incentive for bringing manufacturing back to the United States in the sectors like semiconductors, batteries, and critical minerals. Ms. Overby, in this sense, friendshoring may be replacing the phrase economic security in the United States. But underneath us is the idea of improving the security of supply chain. Could you give us a sense of what the United States hope to achieve and some of those tools it is using in more detail, please?
Sure, thank you. So one good example would be CHIPS 4, where the U.S. has, the Biden administration has created, and they call them different things, frameworks, partnerships, coalitions, but basically groupings of like-minded countries to help ultimately secure supply chains. We saw very clearly, and in some cases painfully, the supply chain disruptions through COVID. In Korea, you had your own experience with when China placed export controls on urea. I think many countries have experienced Chinese economic coercion, the Japanese, the Australians. But so the U.S. approach, what we want to try to do is, again, like-minded countries. There's something called a mineral supply partnership that is made up of Korea, Japan, the European Commission, the UK, several other countries. The two countries that are not there would be Russia and China. I think The U.S. goal is we recognize we can't do it ourselves, but to find these groupings, these like-minded countries. You mentioned that the changing view of free trade agreements. That's I think a really important point. The Biden administration has launched something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And Korea is one of the founding members and has joined all 4 of the pillars. There is hope that as this year we're the APEC host, that there will be some early harvest, some deliverables for that agreement when we host APEC in San Francisco in November. But again, everything we seem to be doing now seems to be groupings of like-minded countries. And I'll stop there.
I forgot to turn on the mic. Thank you, Mr. Avi. I'm Ms. Avi. Overby. Private companies are interested in making their supply chains more resilient and less vulnerable to the choke point and shortages caused by natural disasters, pandemics, or political interference as well. Here, companies are also interested in security, though for them it is economic and supply security rather than national security, although the former is directly related to the latter. I heard that a company efforts to shore up their supply chains generally have the support of the United States government. Moreover, for companies to develop the more secure supply chains, they are moving from the just-in-time model to a just-in-case model. Then, Ms. Overby, please tell us what are some of the benefits to these changes. In addition, from the private sector's perspective, please share your idea of some downside that governments should be considering as they move to improve the resiliency of their supply chains. That is to say, what does that mean in terms of the optimal policy for governments? Please.
Okay. Well, as we're seeing, as companies look to diversify their supply chains, it's more expensive. You're exactly correct. Instead of just in time, to pay for that just in case, that often requires storage and additional investment up front. Korea's former trade minister, Johan Koo, was in Washington at a KEI event in December, and he mentioned that he had his team look at Korea's key imports that only come from 1 or 2 countries. And he was shocked to discover that there was a huge list, like over 5,000 products, and that he had tasked his team with looking for alternative destinations to secure those inputs. The same is true with companies. So, as we saw these chip shortages that impacted empty car lots. We couldn't buy, there were no cars for sale because our auto companies had to stop their supply chains because they couldn't get critical parts, mostly semiconductors, but there were some other things too. And it's not always the expensive items. If you don't have the right fuse or bulb or whatever it is, and the supply chain isn't working, it can be very expensive. So I think the way U.S. companies are looking at this is, again, looking at you're going to see a lot more collaborations, a lot more joint ventures. And we're seeing the Biden administration do it, again, by like-minded countries. So I think for governments, the best way to look at this, how to deal with it is, can you find a grouping of countries or in the private sector companies who you have good relationship with friends. One of the things one of our colleagues, Wendy Cutler, used to say is that one of the problems with free trade agreements in the U.S. is Americans don't understand them. And she suggested we should change the name. Instead of calling it a free trade agreement, we should call it a trusted supply chain agreement. So South Korea, you're a trusted supply chain partner. And I would argue that all of our FTA partners are trusted supply chain partners. So it's just a different way to look at it.
Okay, thank you. That's very impressive. Trusted supply chain partner is Korea. Okay.
I thought it was brilliant, but unfortunately, it never caught on. No one here thinks it's brilliant other than me and now you.
Okay. Let's back to the Korea. Mr. Yeon, I heard that Korea is developing an early warning system for supply chain disruption. Is this a tool that you could see being expanded and deployed either regionally or with key partners?
Yeah, so after we had urea crisis in 2021, Korean government introduced this early warning system. So basically, we actually figured out what are the weak points in our supply chains, and we found we actually listed up like alternative alternatives or solutions to these maybe sources. I mean, when the disruption occurs, we try to find the solutions based on this early warning system or the list of exporters which we not yet depend on, but yeah. But so basically, Korean government, we would like to share our experience, but it is quite difficult. I think, as Tami pointed out earlier, the best possible way to achieve like economic security or supply chain resiliency is through cooperation and collaboration with friends, because yeah, in globalized world, there is no economic threats that only affect one particular country. Unlike like military threats, economic threats by nature can only be resolved in a collective way, since all countries are interlinked by a combination of trade relationships and input-output like relationship in production. So if interdependency is part of the problem, I think we should it should be also part of the solution. But regarding this early warning system, it is difficult to exchange supply chain information in real time, since it would expose countries' weakness or choke points. So this is my personal view. I think the principle of response should be ex post, like the goal of the cooperation, and should concentrate on prompt and timely joint response and joint responses when problems arise, rather than an ex-ante market restructuring that can cause even further market distortion. Also, it should be also market-oriented. I think government's role should be carefully limited to assisting the private sector in preparing for a crisis by providing accurate information before a crisis occurs, as well as helping the private sector in overcoming a crisis as quickly as possible. By providing prepared like solutions in a crisis. So in terms of that, we developed the early warning system. Also, our government is trying to make a fund to help private sector when crisis occurs. So we are, yeah, actually welcome to share our experiences, but we should think more deliberately on this issue, whether we can actually exchange this information in real time with our allies or like-minded countries.
Thank you. Let's look at the other part of the definition of economic security. Economic security can be interpreted as another concept of protectionism. So let's think about this as Frankly, I have been surprised by the Biden administration's continuation of many Trump's policy, albeit with different rhetoric, which culminate in the December rejection of 2 World Trade Organization decisions that went against the United States. In fact, US public opinion has shifted against China over the past decades, and China is now viewed as both an economic and security threat. Ms. Overby, do you think that is possible that the issue will be de-emphasized if there is a change in China's stance of foreign economic policy? Or do you think economic security will be continuously a priority issue regardless of China factor? I believe most people agree that open trade made America significantly richer, while America First policy and decoupling make America poorer, suggested by an MBR paper written by Amidi et al. 2022. Please give your idea, please.
Well, you raise really fascinating issues. First of all, I should caveat this by saying we're coming into the U.S. presidential election season. We're 2 years away now, so and unfortunately, China bashing is popular with both parties. And in a presidential election, I'm afraid we're going to see more of it. And I think that's partly one of the reasons why we have not seen any dramatic changes to some of the Trump tariff policies, which from my personal perspective, it's just bad policy. Tariffs are taxes. The consumer pays them. President Trump used to always say, oh, the Chinese are paying this. The Chinese aren't paying it. The American consumers and the importers, if they're not passing them on, are paying it. So I do have concerns about that. But I also think that the polling in the U.S. does show that most Americans believe that that China is not that their decision to join the WTO and what we had hoped they would move more towards a rules-based international system. That didn't happen. And I think as a result of that, most companies, and most Americans would say that China, there are concerns that have to be addressed, whether it's forced technology, cyber theft. I read recently where 5 South Korean engineers are being prosecuted for selling Korean trade secrets to the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese are not playing fair. One of the things about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, when President Biden first rolled that program out, the framing language he used was democracy versus autocracy. And I thought that was a big mistake. Prime Minister Lee of Singapore also much more eloquently said, please don't try to force other countries to choose between the US or China, because if you force that choice, you're not going to like the answer. China is almost everyone in Asia's #1 trade partner. What he suggested and what the Biden administration moved to was they're framing it now as a rules-based system versus countries who don't follow the rules. And your Prime Minister, Han Duck-soo, said, look, Korea fully supports IPEF, but it should be inclusive, that any economy that is willing and able to meet the high principles of IPEF should be welcome. And he underscored very clearly, and I'm talking China here, if China is willing and able to meet these high principles, they should be welcome. And I completely agree with that. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. So far, we have heard expert opinions on the concept of economic security. Now, it's necessary to think about how the US and South Korea will cooperate in the field of the economic security, especially in the supply chain. Mr. YEON, we've seen a significant amount of focus on effort to strengthen US supply chains in areas such as semiconductors and clean energy technologies. Whether it is Samsung's investment in new semiconductor facility in Texas or some of the clean energy technologies, Korea has played a role in influencing US supply chains. Are there areas where the United States can take steps to improve the security of US supply chains? In addition, are there any measures that Korean companies want from the United States?
I think that's a good question, but also a very difficult question. So I think I'd like to first think about the economic security in two ways. First, defensive economic security, and second, like offensive economic security. And first, when we think about the defensive economic security measures, I think the objective is to seize or achieve minimum viable capability. I think that's what the current, like the U.S. government is doing. I think, for example, CHIPS and Science Act, that particular act will provide like 52 billion US dollars for 5 years to semiconductor industry, but that's not huge money. Like, for example, like one company like Samsung, they invested $100 billion for 3 years from 2017 to 2019. Like TSMC, they also invested, like they have a plan of investing like over $100 billion for 3 years, 2021 to 2023. So I think 52 billion is not that big money. So I think the U.S. objective right now is to achieve minimum viable capability in the United States. And the key area for the Korea-US cooperation, I think, is probably the workforce issue, like solving the workforce, the shortage in workforce, and also critical minerals. I think the IRA is maybe is effective in a way, like you know, eliminating China in the U.S. market, but I'm not sure whether that's possible. So still, I think Korea, the U.S., Japan, EU, like all like-minded countries, they are highly depend on Chinese critical minerals. So I think we should find a way to actually solve that issue. And secondly, regarding the offensive economic security measures, I think the objective is to make everyone play fair and also develop advanced tech capability. And the key area for South Korea-US cooperation is probably export control corporations. Like I know the US is trying to replace Wassenaar Agreement arrangement with some kind of new mechanism, like multilateral export mechanism. So Korea might also cooperate with that. But also, what I want to emphasize is cooperation in emerging techs. I think Korea is a key link in technology supply chains, such as semiconductors and batteries. So I think Korea can be more active in like bilateral, like multilateral, but also unilateral way to improve the security of U.S. supply chains. Regarding the measures, I'm not sure, but at this point, I think when we having this IRA, I think the maybe what we want the most right now is, you know, just having not that much protectionism or like, how can I say, like America first, too much like America first, like, oriented policies, like discriminated policies in the United States.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Yeon also have a very big concern about the protectionism of the economic security. Ms. Overby, Are there areas outside of semiconductors and clean energy that you think are ripe for the cooperation between Korea and the United States?
Yes, I think biotech, solar, wind, energy, nuclear, small modular reactors. Again, I think they're Korean and American companies. There's a complementary system there that can be utilized. I also would like to comment about your, both of you have mentioned the protectionism. And I think you're absolutely right. It's very unfortunate that, the phrase and the policy America first, to me naturally means everyone else second. That's not a good trade policy. When, for example, when trade agreements are concluded, the way you know a successful deal has been achieved is when the parties are equally upset at the end, because that means everyone has given up something in order to get something. So it's balance. And in an America First policy, it's not balanced. I really believe America, to be our strongest is to help our friends and our allies and our partners also be strong. And again, principles, rules-based, and showing the kind of leadership that the U.S. used to show. I wish we could get back to that, because the whole concept of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, the goal was to make that high standard, high quality, comprehensive agreement so good that the Chinese would want to join, and that the U.S. and the other parties of the agreement at that time, we wanted China to join, but only if they were willing and able, when they were willing and able to meet those high standards. It's so ironic that the Chinese now are moving towards joining and we're nowhere to be seen. So this growing protectionism is a real serious issue, and I would argue one of the biggest challenges America's facing. If we want to exercise leadership, we need to go back to playing fair and a rules-based system and try to remove protectionism.
Thank you, Ms. Overby. Actually, I like the word complementary relationships. I think that is the most important key word between United States and Korea. We have to go toward the accomplish the complementary relation between us.
Yes.
I'm going to wrap up this.
We've seen so many so many partnerships where that's on display. One of the longest serving joint ventures in Korea is with LG Caltex. I think it started in 1967, and it's still going strong today. And the reason is both companies bring something to the table to complement the other. And again, my experience with Korea is there's so many areas where we can make progress finding those joint areas of cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to our final questions. I think we have two final questions. First, I'm going to ask Ms. Overby. One area of concerning is China's increasing use of economic coercion. With the deployment of THAAD, but also more recently against Australia, there are steps that the United States and Korea, or together with other partners, can take to better manage economic coercion when it does occur?
That's a brilliant question, and yes, I think there are. Much like this year, we will celebrate the 70th anniversary of our mutual defense treaty, our alliance. I think there's an opportunity to create an economic alliance where And it should be broader than, it should be the US and Korea, but it should be broader than just the two of us and other countries that share these like-minded views. And with the idea being that any country that is economically attacked with economic coercion would be viewed by all of these partners as an attack of all. So that we could, again, no one wants to face an attack individually. We are much stronger collectively. We share so many values and so many mutual views that I think we're stronger together. So I would like to see us create a economic, and it shouldn't be called the Chinese, because it should be used if Russia or India or Brazil or whoever, or whoever the party that is not following the rules-based system, we should all work together to help encourage them to come back towards the light and the rules-based system.
Yes, that's very important. I think the sharing universal value is a very important measure, I think. So that's a good answer. Mr. YEON, Korea recently released the Indo-Pacific strategy lays out the objective of developing multi-layered economic security networks in the region. The U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy also discusses developing resilient and secure supply chains. Please tell us how the U.S. and Korea can cooperate in the Indo-Pacific on developing resilient supply chains.
Yeah, I think Dr. Kwak Sung-il is the expert on Indo-Pacific strategy, so I'm not sure whether I'm the right person to be answering this question. But first, regarding the visions or objectives, I think the U.S. And Korea, we share the same visions. The U.S., like the Biden government, they updated Indo-Pacific strategy in February 2022, last year. And it stated 5 objectives. First, like advance a free and open Indo-Pacific. Second, build connections with and beyond the region. And third, drive regional prosperity. Fourth, bolster Indo-Pacific security. And fifth, build regional resilience to transnational threats. So regarding these 5 objectives, I think the first, advance a free and open Indo-Pacific, that's related to the value of freedom, and build connections within the beyond the region and drive regional prosperity. That's related to prosperity, economic prosperity, and the fourth and fifth objectives of the United States related to the security. I think that's quite aligned with the Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. Korea's vision is free, peaceful, and prosperous in the Pacific. So basically, I think we have the same, we pursue the same values in our strategies. And in terms of economic security issues or resilient supply chains, I think we have also the same component in our Indo-Pacific Action Plan, which is IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So I think making the IPEF, IPAF effectively, that might be the first step or the key step toward our cooperation in the Pacific strategy. And also, earlier Tami mentioned about the economic coercion issue. I'd like to mention a little bit more about this economic coercion issue, because when we think about the responding to economic coercion, Korea is quite different from Japan and Australia, because Korea do not have the framework, the right framework. For example, I think 2021, Lithuania suffered from the Chinese economic coercion, and EU actually responded collectively on behalf of Lithuania. But for example, so if China they do some economic coercion against Japan, probably Japan can use maybe Quad. Australia also might able to use Quad, but Korea, actually, we do not have this kind of unilateral framework or multilateral framework to use against these coercions. So I think in that sense, IPAF is quite a good framework that we can, especially Korea, can utilize when we have this economic coercion issue. So I think to answer your question, I think we should develop this IPAF rightly and effectively for achieving this cooperation in economic security issues, including the resilient supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the two panelists for sincere answering and difficult questions. Today we can see that there are still many areas left for Korea and the United States to move toward much higher level of cooperation. For this, I think sincere conversation between Korea and the United States is the most important. Thank you for the participating. And Troy, do you have anything to add?
Dr. Kwon, Dr. YEON, Tami, President Kim, Ambassador Stevens, thank you all for being part of this. This has been a very in-depth discussion. We've covered a lot of topics. As Ambassador Stevens said early on, we are talking about issues and in terms that many people didn't even think we'd be talking about a few years ago. I think the major theme that I would like to say that comes from this for me is not that we're going to face challenges and struggles that we've seen with the IRA, but that ultimately to deal with these issues, we need to work together and cooperatively and in a fair way to not just the United States and Korea, but to other interested partners as we work together to try and ensure that our supply chains are resilient, that we can deal with economic coercion, and that we can challenge or deal with these issues such as the transition to clean energy in a thoughtful way. And I would just like to thank you all. I think this has been a really great discussion, and I commend you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have a great time, so I think it's time to wrap up our seminar. So let's see on the future, in the near futures. Thank you.
새해 복 많이 받으세요.
Thanks,
새해
everyone.
복 많이 받으세요. Happy New Year. Thank you.
Troy, it was good to see you again.
You too, and look forward to trying to get together with you next time in Korea.
Yeah, sure.